We come to Thursday, the night before Jesus' crucifixion. With the exception of Good Friday and Easter Sunday, there is no day in Holy Week that the Gospel writers devote more material to than this day. In fact, I'd imagine that for most of us, the events of Thursday are perhaps one of the more familiar events in this week. On this day, Jesus has the final Passover meal with his disciples. He institutes the Lord's Supper. He washes his disciples' feet, which Pastor Kim talked about on Tuesday's devotional. He gives the disciples the commandments to love one another, and he predicts Peter's infamous betrayal. But what I want to draw our hearts to this evening is a unique event found in Luke's Gospel account of Jesus' final hours before his crucifixion in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, before we jump into that, I want to begin by asking you all a simple question. Have you ever felt the stinging silence of God? I think it's something we've all experienced. We all know what it's like to pray to God for something, to pour our hearts to God for a real burden, only to find God's response to our tears is nothing but silence, especially in this season. And it can be easy to interpret that silence either that God has abandoned us or at best is indifference toward us. You see, as we get closer to Jesus' crucifixion, his circle gets smaller and smaller. Throughout the timeline of the gospel accounts, Jesus' followers begin to thin out more and more. But by the time we get to Thursday, we begin to see the reality of that set in all the more acutely. Jesus will be left alone and abandoned. In Luke 22:21-23, during Jesus' last Passover meal with his disciples, we find one of his disciples, Judas, he would betray him. In verses 31-34, we see Jesus predicting that another one of his disciples, Peter, would deny knowing Jesus a total of 3 times. In fact, in that same dialogue, we are told that the other disciples would likewise do the same and desert Jesus in his hour of need. As we move forward to the Garden of Gethsemane in Luke chapter 22, verses 40-46, we find Jesus' disciples falling asleep as he is left alone to contend with the dawning horrors of his crucifixion. And yet, as painful as that is, there is still one more reality that Jesus will have to face before the events of the crucifixion. The silence of a father who will not save his beloved son from this hour. Luke 22:42 records for us Jesus praying these words to the Father, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Does this prayer seem familiar to you? Has this heart-wrenching plea limped out of your mouth in desperation? I think the more significant question is this: have you ever felt the sting of God's silence? On this Thursday night, just hours before the horrible events of Friday, Jesus was alone. He would soon undergo the events leading to his crucifixion alone. And in a real way, it would be tempting to believe that in this hour of greatest need, his Father, along with the disciples, had completely abandoned him and denied him. But it is here that we read a peculiar event found only in Luke's Gospel account. Luke 22:43, "And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him." It's a unique verse, but a needed verse, because what it tells us is that in the midst of what was Jesus' most difficult prayer, in the midst of what was Jesus' most terrifying and seemingly insurmountable task of bearing the wrath of God to die for sinners, in the midst of apparent silence from God, heaven had not abandoned Jesus, but rather heaven stands beside Jesus as he faces his calling. God is with Jesus even in the dark. Jesus will go on to face the events of Friday. He would drink the cup of God's wrath, but he would do so without trembling. He would push through the darkness, enduring the cross, despising the shame for the joy set before him, according to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. He would not be swallowed up by death, but rather death will be swallowed up in victory, so that we can say, "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" So let me ask you the same question I asked before. Have you ever felt the sting of God's silence? During this season, it can be easy to interpret that silence from God as his lack of care for us. And it can be quite honestly a scary thing. But let this verse remind you of this key idea this Thursday. We have hope because God is present with us even in the dark. How might this encourage you today? First, because God is present with us in the dark, then we are encouraged to lean on him in prayer. Notice that God's care by way of the angel does not keep Jesus from prayer, but rather in verse 44, he prays all the more earnestly. Knowing that God is with us in the dark should encourage us to hold on to him even more tightly, because in the dark, we are certain that he is our one good thing. So in the midst of your struggles, how are you leaning on God? Are you praying all the more? Are you praying even more earnestly? The darker the room, the tighter the grip, and the more we depend and trust on others to lead. So beloved, make it your aim to pray all the more during this season of darkness, so that you might be comforted by his presence all the more. Second, because God is present with us in the dark, trust that even the dark is ordained by God for our highest good. In this text, notice that the angel does not lead Jesus out of the darkness, but God uses the angel to strengthen Jesus in the darkness. So consider what God is currently doing in your life through this season of difficulty. Is he teaching you to have greater faith in him? Is he exposing a competing rival in your heart in order to secure a singular devotion to him? Beloved, God does not intend to use the difficulty in our lives to weaken us, but to strengthen us in the ways that matter. We can take comfort that although the darkness seems overwhelming, God intends it for our good. We can know that behind the frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. One final thought. As Thursday ends, realize that Jesus will have to endure Friday. And on Friday, Jesus would endure the darkness. He would experience God's wrath for sinners and know what it was like for God to turn his face away. He would find himself alone, not just from people, but from the Trinity itself. And so let us not forget that in a very real sense, Jesus was separated from the Father. But you know what? He was separated so that we might not be. In the divine mystery of it all, he was separated so that we would never have to wonder if God is truly with us in our darkness. He was separated so that we might say, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. So church family, are you currently feeling the sting of God's silence? Know that even in this, heaven stands beside you. In your difficulty, know that you have more than angels, but Jesus himself who stands beside you. Hebrews 4:14-16 says this: Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may find mercy and find grace to help in time of need.